The rope burns against Jackson Blackwood's neck as the crowd below bays for blood. In minutes, he'll swing for stealing bread to feed his starving sons. But as the executioner raises his hand, a pregnant woman steps forward from the jeering mob. "I claim him under frontier law." Eleanor Hayes shouts, her voice cutting through the winter wind like a blade. What happens next will change everything. Welcome to our story today. Stay with me until the very end to see how far redemption can reach, and comment below with your city, so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The Montana Territory in 1878 was a land where mercy froze to death before sunrise and justice wore a hangman's hood. On this bitter February morning in the town of Redemption, a crowd of nearly 200 souls had gathered in the town square, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the sub-zero air as they waited for a man to die. Jackson Blackwood stood on the gallows platform, his hands bound behind his back with rough hemp rope, his dark hair whipping across his weathered face in the relentless wind. At 34, he looked older, lines etched deep around his green eyes, from years of running, years of looking over his shoulder, years of keeping secrets that could destroy what little remained of his shattered life. The noose hung heavy around his neck, coarse fibers scratching against skin that bore the scars of a dozen close calls. Below him, the crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with the peculiar hunger that only a public execution could satisfy. Men in wool coats and worn boots shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep warm while savoring the spectacle. Women clutched their children close, some covering young eyes, while others allowed them to watch, believing that witnessing justice served would teach valuable lessons about the consequences of breaking God's law. "String him up," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Thieving bastard got what he deserved." Sheriff Tom Brady, a barrel-chested man with iron-gray whiskers, raised his hand for silence. His voice carried easily across the square, practiced from years of maintaining order in a town that attracted every type of desperate soul the frontier could produce. "Jackson Blackwood," Brady announced, unfolding a piece of paper with theatrical precision. "You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for the crime of theft. You broke into Henderson's General Store on the night of February 14, 1878, and stole food and supplies valued at $12.37. The penalty for theft in the Montana Territory is death by hanging. Do you have any last words?" Jackson's jaw tightened as he scanned the crowd below. Somewhere in those hostile faces he searched for even a glimmer of understanding, a single soul who might comprehend that a father would do anything, steal, lie, kill, if necessary to keep his children from starving. But all he saw was judgment, cold and merciless as the wind that cut through his thin shirt. "I regret nothing," he said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "A man protects his family. That's all I've ever done." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Someone threw a stone that clattered against the platform near his feet. Sheriff Brady nodded to the executioner, a hooded figure who had performed this grim duty in towns across the territory for the past 15 years. The man's identity remained a mystery, but his efficiency was legendary. "May God have mercy on your soul," Brady intoned. The executioner stepped forward, his gloved hand reaching for the lever that would drop the platform beneath Jackson's feet. In 30 seconds, maybe less, Jackson Blackwood would be dead, and his two young sons, Matthew age 8 and Daniel age 6, would become orphans left to survive alone in a mountain cave with only a dwindling supply of stolen food and their father's desperate prayers to protect them. Jackson closed his eyes and thought of their faces. Matthew, so serious for his age, with the same green eyes that Jackson saw in his own reflection. The boy had been forced to grow up too quickly, becoming a little man when circumstances demanded it. And Daniel, still young enough to believe that his father could fix anything, that tomorrow would always be better than today. They were hidden in a cave 3 miles north of town, waiting for him to return, with more food, more hope, more promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The irony wasn't lost on him. So Nathan Blackwood, for that had been his real name once in another life, had saved hundreds of lives during the war, had pulled men back from death's door with nothing but skill and determination. Now he was about to die for the crime of trying to save the 2 lives that mattered most. "Wait!" The voice cut through the crowd's bloodthirsty anticipation like a knife through silk. Clear, strong, and unmistakably female, it carried an authority that made even Sheriff Brady pause, with his hand halfway to his holster. The crowd turned as one, craning their necks to see who had dared interrupt their entertainment. From the edge of the square, a woman stepped forward, her movements deliberate and confident despite the obvious burden she carried. She was perhaps 25 years old, with auburn hair pinned back severely and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Her dark wool coat couldn't entirely conceal her advanced pregnancy. She looked to be about 7 months along, but she moved with the grace of someone accustomed to handling herself in difficult situations. Eleanor Hayes had been widowed 6 months ago when her husband Thomas fell through the ice while checking his trap lines. She'd been managing their small homestead alone ever since proving to the skeptical men of redemption that a woman could survive just fine without a husband's protection. She was known for her sharp tongue, her sharper mind, and her complete unwillingness to back down from anyone who underestimated her. "I said, wait," she repeated, pushing through the crowd with calm determination. People stepped aside, some out of respect, others out of simple curiosity about what the Hayes widow could possibly want with a condemned thief. Sheriff Brady's face flushed red with irritation. "Mrs. Hayes, this is no place for a lady in your condition. Go on home now, and let us finish our business." Eleanor stopped at the base of the gallows, tilting her head back to look up at Jackson. For a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition perhaps of shared desperation of lives pushed to the breaking point by circumstances beyond their control. "I'm invoking the law of claim," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Even Jackson, who had resigned himself to death, felt his heart skip a beat. The law of claim was an old frontier statute rarely used and often forgotten that allowed a citizen to claim the labor of a condemned man instead of his life. It had been written in the early days of territorial expansion, when every able-bodied man was too valuable to waste on a rope when building civilization required all the hands it could get. Sheriff Brady's face went from red to purple. "Now see here, Mrs. Hayes." "The law is clear, Sheriff," Eleanor interrupted, reaching into her coat and pulling out a worn leather book. "Territory Statute 847, subsection C. Any citizen of good standing may claim the labor of a condemned man for a period of 1 year, said labor to be performed in service to the community and under the supervision of the claiming party. I am a citizen of good standing, Sheriff Brady. I pay my taxes, I attend church, and I've broken no laws. I claim this man's labor." The crowd erupted in arguments and protests. Men shouted over each other, some supporting Eleanor's right to invoke the law, others demanding that justice be served with rope and gravity as God intended. Women whispered furiously among themselves, scandalized by the idea of a pregnant widow taking responsibility for a convicted criminal. "This is highly irregular," Brady protested, but Eleanor could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The law was the law, and frontier towns lived and died by their adherence to whatever legal structure they could maintain in the wilderness. "Irregular, perhaps," Eleanor replied coolly, "but perfectly legal, unless you're suggesting that the law doesn't apply when it's inconvenient." From the crowd, a new voice emerged. Judge Cornelius Morgan, the traveling circuit judge who had presided over Jackson's trial 3 days earlier, pushed his way to the front. He was a thin, scholarly man who carried the weight of territorial law in his worn leather satchel and took his responsibilities seriously. "The lady is correct," Morgan announced reluctantly. "The law of claim is valid, though it hasn't been invoked in this territory for nearly 8 years. Mrs. Hayes, are you certain you understand what you're requesting? This man would be your responsibility for 1 full year. Any crimes he commits, any debts he incurs, any damage he causes, all of it would fall on your shoulders." Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "I understand perfectly, Judge Morgan. I'm not asking for charity or making this decision lightly. I need help with my homestead, and Mr. Blackwood needs an alternative to the Noose. It seems like a practical arrangement." Jackson stared down at her in amazement. He had never seen this woman before today, had no idea why she would risk everything to save a stranger's life. Her steady gaze met his again, and he saw something there that had been absent from every other face in the crowd: compassion. "Why?" he called down to her, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her swollen belly. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Because everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Blackwood, and because I believe there's more to your story than stealing $12 worth of food." The crowd's protests grew louder, but Judge Morgan raised his hand for silence. "The law is clear, and Mrs. Hayes has the right to invoke it. However," he continued, turning to face Eleanor directly, "I must warn you of the consequences. If you claim this man and he commits any crime during his year of service, you will be held equally responsible. If he runs, you'll face charges for aiding a fugitive. If he harms anyone, you'll be considered an accessory. Are you prepared to accept these risks?" "I am," Eleanor replied without hesitation. Morgan nodded slowly, then turned to Jackson. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, do you accept Mrs. Hayes's claim? The alternative, of course, is the rope." Jackson's mind raced. He thought of Matthew and Daniel waiting in their cold cave, slowly starving while their father faced his final moments. He thought of the long chain of events that had led him here, the war, the killing, the years of running and hiding. Perhaps this was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to finally stop running and start living again. "I accept," he said firmly, "and I give you my word, Mrs. Hayes, that I won't make you regret this decision." Sheriff Brady looked as if he'd swallowed something sour, but he nodded to the executioner, who began the process of removing the noose from Jackson's neck. "Very well. The prisoner is released into the custody of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, subject to the terms and conditions of Territory Statute 847. Mrs. Hayes, he's your responsibility now. Don't make me regret this." As the rope fell away from his neck, Jackson felt as if he could breathe for the first time in years. The executioner cut the bonds around his wrists, and circulation slowly returned to his hands. He made his way carefully down the gallows steps, his legs unsteady after the ordeal. Eleanor waited for him at the bottom, her expression calm but watchful. "We need to talk," she said quietly, "but not here. Too many ears, too many opinions." The crowd was beginning to disperse, grumbling about justice denied and the strange ways of women. Some lingered, hoping for more drama, but the cold was too bitter and the show was clearly over. "My wagon's over there," Eleanor said, nodding toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to two hardy-looking horses. "We'll go to my place, and you can tell me the real reason you stole that food." As they walked toward the wagon, Jackson became aware of eyes following them, of whispered conversations and pointing fingers. He was used to being watched. It came with the territory when you were a wanted man. But this felt different. This wasn't the attention of bounty hunters or lawmen. This was the curiosity of people trying to understand why a respectable widow would throw her reputation away on a convicted thief. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," he said quietly as Eleanor climbed up onto the wagon seat with surprising agility for a woman so far along in her pregnancy. "Probably not," she agreed, settling herself and taking up the reins. "But I have a feeling you don't know what you've gotten yourself into either. Climb up, Mr. Blackwood. We have a lot to discuss, and winter doesn't wait for anyone." Jackson hauled himself up onto the wagon seat beside her, still trying to process the rapid turn his life had taken. An hour ago, he'd been prepared to die. Now, he was sitting next to a woman who had saved his life for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. As Eleanor guided the horses out of town, Jackson caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the steps of the hotel. Marshal Garrett, a federal lawman who had been tracking Jackson for the better part of 3 years, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face thoughtful. Their eyes met briefly, and Jackson saw something there that made his blood run cold recognition. Marshal Garrett knew exactly who he was looking at. Not Jackson Blackwood, petty thief and drifter, but Dr. Nathan Blackwood, wanted for the killing of James Reynolds in self-defense 3 years ago in Kansas. The fact that Reynolds had been the first to draw that he'd been drunk and belligerent and looking for a fight hadn't mattered to the law. What mattered was that Reynolds was dead and Nathan Blackwood had disappeared into the wilderness with his 2 young sons. As the wagon rolled out of Redemption toward Eleanor's homestead, Jackson realized that his troubles were far from over. He might have escaped the noose, but his past was still hunting him, and now he'd dragged an innocent woman and her unborn child into the line of fire. The homestead sat in a small valley about 5 miles northeast of town, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a ridge of pine-covered hills. It was a modest spread, a 2-room cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings that had seen better days. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and maybe even a hot meal. Eleanor brought the wagon to a stop near the front door and set the brake. "Welcome to your new home, Mr. Blackwood. It's not much, but it's mine, and for the next year, it's yours too." Jackson climbed down and helped Eleanor from the wagon, noting how she tried to hide the effort it cost her. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to tell you something." "I have 2 sons," she interrupted, surprising him. "Matthew and Daniel, ages 8 and 6 respectively. They're hidden somewhere in the mountains north of town, probably in a cave or abandoned mining claim, and they're the real reason you stole that food." Jackson stared at her in shock. "How could you possibly know that?" Eleanor smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her. "Because I was listening during your trial, Mr. Blackwood. Most people heard a thief making excuses, but I heard a father trying to save his children. The way you talked about protecting your family, the specific items you stole, mostly food suitable for children, medicine for fever and cough. It wasn't hard to figure out." "They're waiting for me," Jackson said urgently. "They don't know what happened today. They're expecting me to come back with food, and if I don't, then we'll go get them," Eleanor said simply, as if rescuing 2 abandoned children from a mountain cave was the most natural thing in the world. "But first you're going to tell me the truth about who you really are and why you're running. All of it, Mr. Blackwood. If I'm risking my life and my child's future on you, I deserve to know what I'm dealing with." They made their way into the cabin, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the stone fireplace and a pot of stew simmered on the iron stove. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that spoke of a woman's touch. It was the kind of home Jackson hadn't seen in years, the kind of place where a man could imagine building a life. "Sit down," Eleanor said, indicating a chair near the fire. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." She was right. Jackson couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything more substantial than hardtack and jerky. The smell of the stew made his stomach clench with hunger, but he remained standing too tense to relax. "Mrs. Hayes, you need to understand." "Eleanor," she corrected, ladling stew into a bowl. "If we're going to be living under the same roof for a year, we might as well use first names, and you need to eat before you fall over. When's the last time you had a hot meal?" Jackson accepted the bowl gratefully, his hands shaking slightly as he raised the spoon to his lips. The stew was simple: beef potatoes, carrots, onions, but it tasted like heaven after weeks of near starvation. For a few minutes he ate in silence, while Eleanor settled herself in the chair across from him, her hands folded over her belly. "Now then," she said when he'd taken the edge off his hunger, "suppose you start with your real name." Jackson set down his spoon and met her steady gaze. There was no point in lying. She'd already proven herself too observant to fool, and she'd risked too much to deserve anything less than the truth. "Dr. Nathan Blackwood," he said quietly. "I was a surgeon during the war, served with the Union Army from 1862 to 1865. After the war, I tried to build a practice in Lawrence, Kansas. That's where I met my wife, Sarah. We were married in 1867, had the boys in 69 and 71. "What happened to your wife?" Eleanor asked gently. "Cholera 2 years ago. The whole town was hit and I couldn't save her." His voice caught slightly. "I was a doctor and I couldn't save my own wife." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "And then, after Sarah died, I tried to keep the practice going, but the grief, I started drinking too much, making mistakes. People lost confidence in me. Work dried up. Money got tight. I was thinking about moving the boys somewhere we could start fresh when James Reynolds showed up." Jackson paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. Reynolds was the son of Judge Maxwell Reynolds, one of the most powerful men in Kansas. He was drunk looking for trouble, and he'd heard that the town doctor was having financial problems. He offered to buy my practice and my home for about half what they were worth, said it was a generous offer considering my reputation. I'm guessing you refused. I told him to get out of my office. He didn't take it well, started making threats, said his father could make life very difficult for me if I didn't cooperate. I told him his father didn't scare me, and that's when he drew his gun. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes intent. You killed him in self-defense. I did. But there were no witnesses except for the boys who were upstairs asleep. By the time help arrived, all anyone could see was James Reynolds dead on my office floor and me standing over him with a smoking gun. Judge Reynolds arrived before the sheriff did, and I could see in his eyes that it didn't matter what had really happened. His son was dead and someone was going to pay. So you ran. I grabbed the boys and what little money I had left, and we disappeared that same night. We've been running ever since, staying ahead of bounty hunters and federal marshals. I've been using the name Jackson Blackwood, doing whatever work I could find, ranch hand, minor logger, anything that would keep us fed and moving. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his story. Why didn't you just go to trial? Surely self-defense. Would have been my word against Judge Reynolds's, and everyone in Kansas knew which way that verdict would go. The man owns half the state legislature and most of the judges. I would have hanged for murder, and my boys would have ended up in an orphanage or worse. And now you've been stealing to keep them alive. Jackson nodded, shame burning in his chest. I tried to find honest work, but word travels fast in small towns. Someone always recognizes me eventually, or gets suspicious about a man traveling alone with 2 young boys. The past few weeks have been the worst. The boys have been sick, fever, cough, and our money ran out. I couldn't watch them starve, so I did what I had to do. Eleanor stood up slowly, one hand supporting her back as she moved to the window that looked out toward the mountains. Snow was beginning to fall again, thick flakes that would make travel treacherous. How far north are they? She asked. About 3 miles, in an old mining cave near Copper Creek. It's hidden, defensible, but cold as hell. They have blankets and a small fire, but the food I stole is nearly gone. If we don't reach them soon... Then we go tonight, Eleanor said decisively. The snow will cover our tracks and fewer people will be out to see us. Can you find the cave in the dark? Jackson stared at her in amazement. Eleanor, you can't be serious. You're 7 months pregnant. It's freezing, and the terrain is dangerous even in good weather. I can go alone. You can barely stay upright from exhaustion, and you'll need help bringing 2 sick children down from the mountains. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I'm a lot tougher than I look. I've been living alone on this homestead for 6 months, and I haven't died yet. But why? Jackson asked the question that had been burning in him since she'd stepped forward at the gallows. Why would you risk everything for strangers? Eleanor turned from the window, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. Because I know what it's like to be alone and afraid, wondering if anyone in the world cares whether you live or die. When Thomas died, I thought about giving up, thought about selling this place and moving back east to live with my sister. But something made me stay, made me fight. Maybe it was stubborn pride, maybe it was faith, or maybe it was just the knowledge that someone has to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. She moved back to her chair, settling herself carefully. You're not the first desperate person to come through redemption, Nathan, and you won't be the last. This territory is full of people running from something: war, poverty, bad choices, worse luck. Most of them get a rope or a bullet for their troubles, but every now and then someone deserves a chance to start over. What makes you think I deserve that chance? Because you're willing to die for your children, because you chose stealing over abandoning them, because when you had nothing left to lose, you still held on to your love for those boys. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Nathan. For that was who he was now, in this place, where Eleanor Hayes had given him back his real name, felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart during the long months of running and hiding. When was the last time someone had seen good in him? When had anyone last offered him kindness without expecting something in return? We'll need supplies, he said quietly, accepting her decision. Extra blankets, medicine if you have it, food for the journey back. Already thinking ahead? Eleanor approved. There's a medical kit in the bedroom. Thomas was always cutting himself on something or other, and I keep emergency supplies for exactly this kind of situation. Help me gather what we need, and then we'll harness the horses. As they prepared for the dangerous journey into the mountains, Nathan found himself studying Eleanor Hayes with new eyes. She moved with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies and making preparations with the calm competence of someone accustomed to handling crises. There was steel beneath her gentle exterior, a strength that had been forged by hardship and loss. Eleanor, he said, as they loaded the wagon with blankets and medical supplies, there's something else you need to know. That federal marshal in town, Garrett, he recognized me. He knows I'm Nathan Blackwood, not Jackson. If he starts asking questions, if he connects me to you, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Eleanor replied calmly. One crisis at a time, Nathan. Right now, your sons need us. Everything else can wait. As they prepared to venture into the storm-darkened mountains, Nathan realized that his life had changed irrevocably in the span of a few hours. The man who had climbed those gallows steps expecting to die was gone, replaced by someone who had been given an impossible gift: hope. But hope, as Nathan had learned the hard way, could be the most dangerous thing of all. It made you believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that redemption was possible, even for someone who had lost everything. It made you think that maybe, just maybe, you could stop running and start living again. As Eleanor's wagon rolled out into the swirling snow, carrying them toward two frightened children waiting in a cold mountain cave, Nathan allowed himself to believe for the first time in 3 years that the worst might finally be behind them. He had no way of knowing that the worst was yet to come. The mountain trail wound upward through a maze of snow-laden pines and treacherous granite outcroppings, each step more dangerous than the last as the storm intensified around them. Eleanor's wagon lurched and groaned over the uneven terrain, the horses' breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air as they struggled against the deepening drifts. Nathan walked alongside the wagon, one hand gripping the side rail to steady himself, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness ahead for landmarks that would guide them to the hidden cave where his sons waited. "How much farther?" Eleanor called out, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She had insisted on driving despite Nathan's protests, claiming she knew these mountains better than any outsider ever could. "Half a mile, maybe less," Nathan replied, his words torn away by the gale. "There's a lightning-struck pine that marks the turnoff. In this snow, though—" He didn't finish the thought. In this snow, they could pass within yards of the cave and never see it. His boys could freeze to death while their father stumbled blindly through the storm just beyond their reach. The irony would be cruel enough to satisfy whatever malevolent force had been pursuing his family for the past 3 years. Eleanor pulled the wagon to a halt near a cluster of boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. "We need to go on foot from here," she said, climbing down with careful deliberation. "The trail's too narrow for the wagon, and if we get stuck, we'll all freeze." Nathan helped her gather their supplies, blankets, food, medicine, and a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the snow-covered landscape. Every minute they spent in preparation was another minute his sons spent waiting in their cold refuge, but rushing blindly into the mountains would help no one. "Stay close," Nathan warned as they began the final ascent. "The trail drops off sharply on the left side, and there are old mine shafts all through this area. One wrong step—" "I understand," Eleanor replied, her breath coming in short puffs from the exertion. "But Nathan, we need to talk about what happens after we find them. 2 sick children can't make this journey back tonight. We'll have to wait for the storm to pass." Nathan had been trying not to think about that possibility. The cave was barely large enough for him, and the boys, let alone a pregnant woman as well. They would be cramped, cold, and vulnerable if anyone came looking for them. But Eleanor was right. Attempting to bring 2 fevered children down a treacherous mountain trail in a blizzard would be suicide. "There," Nathan said suddenly, pointing to a gnarled pine that had been split down the middle by lightning sometime in the distant past. "That's our marker. The cave entrance is about 200 yards up that ridge." They climbed in silence after that, each focused on the treacherous footing and the promise of shelter ahead. Nathan's heart pounded with more than just physical exertion as they approached the cave. What would they find inside? Were his boys still alive, still healthy enough to make the journey to Eleanor's homestead when the storm passed? The cave entrance was little more than a crack in the granite cliff face, hidden behind a screen of ice-covered brush. Nathan had chosen it precisely because it was so well concealed, but now he worried that concealment might work against them. He pushed through the undergrowth, Eleanor following close behind, and called out softly, "Matthew, Daniel. It's me, boys. I'm back." For a moment there was only silence, and Nathan felt his heart clench with fear. Then from the depths of the cave came a weak voice that made his knees nearly buckle with relief. "Papa, is that really you? It's me, son," Nathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. He held the lantern high as they squeezed through the narrow entrance, and the light revealed a scene that broke his heart. Matthew and Daniel Blackwood, huddled together beneath every blanket and coat Nathan had been able to provide, their faces pale and drawn with fever and exhaustion. Matthew, the older boy, had his arm protectively around his younger brother, trying to share what little warmth they could generate between them. Their eyes were bright with fever, but they widened with wonder when they saw Eleanor behind their father. "Pa, who's the lady?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse from coughing. "Is she going to help us?" "This is Mrs. Hayes," Nathan said, kneeling beside his sons and feeling their foreheads with practiced medical precision. Both boys were running high fevers, though they seemed alert and responsive. "She's the reason I'm here instead of, well, she helped me out of a difficult situation." Eleanor moved carefully into the cramped space, her pregnancy making the already tight quarters even more challenging. "Hello, boys," she said gently. "Your father has told me so much about you. I'm very pleased to finally meet you." "Are you really going to have a baby?" Daniel asked with the blunt curiosity of a 6-year-old. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine warmth Nathan had seen from her since they'd left her homestead. "I am indeed, in about 2 months if everything goes well." "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Matthew wanted to know, though his voice carried the measured tone of someone trying to appear more mature than his years. "That's up to God to decide," Eleanor replied, settling herself as comfortably as possible on the rocky cave floor. "But either way, I'm hoping for a child who's as brave and strong as you two have been." Nathan was examining his sons more thoroughly, checking their breathing, their skin color, their responses to his questions. The fever was concerning, but it wasn't the kind of raging infection that would be life-threatening if treated properly. They were dehydrated and malnourished, but alive and alert. "How long have you been sick?" he asked Matthew, who had always been the more reliable reporter of family crises. 3 days, maybe 4, Matthew replied. "Started with Daniel, then I got it too. We've been drinking water from the creek, but it's so cold it hurts our throats. And the coughing. Mostly at night. Daniel's worse than me." Nathan nodded, already mentally cataloging the treatments he would need to implement. Eleanor had been wise to bring medical supplies, willow bark tea for the fever honey, for the cough warm broths to combat the dehydration. Basic remedies, but effective ones when properly applied. "We're going to get you both well," he promised, though he could see the skepticism in Matthew's eyes. The boy had heard too many promises that couldn't be kept, had learned not to trust in easy reassurances. Eleanor was unpacking their supplies with quiet efficiency, spreading clean blankets, and organizing the medical kit Nathan had assembled from her stores. "Boys, I need you to drink as much of this as you can," she said, handing them a jar of warm broth she had somehow managed to keep heated during their journey. "And then we're going to make you both some medicine tea that will help with the fever." "It tastes terrible, doesn't it?" Daniel asked suspiciously. "Most good medicine does," Eleanor admitted, "but I have some honey that will make it better. And if you're very brave about taking your medicine, I might have a piece of peppermint candy for each of you." The boys' eyes widened. Candy was a luxury they hadn't enjoyed in months, a reminder of better times when their father had been a respected doctor instead of a fugitive thief. As Nathan prepared the willow bark tea and Eleanor tended to the boys with gentle efficiency, a strange sense of domestic normalcy settled over the cramped cave. For the first time in years, Nathan found himself part of something that resembled a family, not just a father desperately trying to keep his children alive, but part of a group of people who cared for each other. "Mrs. Hayes," Matthew said as she helped him sip the bitter tea, "why did you help our pa? Most folks don't like us much." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer a question that cut to the heart of their situation. "Sometimes, Matthew, we help people not because we have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Your father found himself in trouble trying to take care of you and Daniel. That tells me he's a good man who loves his children very much. Pa says we might not have to run anymore," Daniel added hopefully. "Is that true?" Nathan and Eleanor exchanged glances over the boys' heads. How much hope could they afford to give these children? How much truth could they bear? "We're going to try very hard to make that happen," Eleanor said carefully. "But it might take some time, and we'll all have to be very careful and very brave." Outside the cave, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small refuge, warmth was slowly returning to the space. Nathan had managed to coax their small fire back to life, and with the additional blankets Eleanor had brought, the boys were beginning to show signs of improvement. Their fevers were breaking, and their breathing was becoming less labored. "Tell me about your farm," Matthew asked Eleanor as she tucked the blankets more securely around him. "Pa says we're going to help you with the work." "It's not a farm exactly," Eleanor explained. "It's what we call a homestead. I have some chickens, a cow, a small garden when the weather's better. There's plenty of work to do, especially with the baby coming. Your father will help with the heavy work, and you boys can help with the animals and other chores." "Do you have horses?" Daniel wanted to know. "2 of them. Buck and Belle. They're the ones who brought us up here tonight. Can we ride them? Eleanor laughed softly. We'll see. First, you need to get completely well, and then we'll talk about riding lessons. Nathan listened to the conversation with mixed emotions. His sons were responding to Eleanor with a trust and openness they hadn't shown to anyone in months. They were starved for normalcy, for the presence of someone who could offer maternal comfort. But Nathan also knew how dangerous hope could be. Every time they had started to settle somewhere, every time the boys had begun to feel safe, their past had caught up with them. Eleanor, he said quietly, we should talk. She understood immediately, glancing at the boys who were finally beginning to doze under the influence of the medicine and the warmth. Boys, try to get some sleep. Your father and I need to discuss some grown-up things. Nathan moved to the mouth of the cave where they could talk without waking the children. Eleanor followed, moving carefully in the confined space. Marshal Garrett wasn't just passing through redemption, Nathan said without preamble. He's been tracking me for months, maybe longer. If he connects me to you, if he realizes what you've done, he'll arrest you, and I'll be charged as an accessory, Eleanor finished. I understand the risks, Nathan. I understood them when I invoked the law of claim. But do you understand what those risks mean? We're not talking about a fine or a few days in jail. They'll hang me and they'll send you to prison. Your child will be born behind bars if you're lucky enough to live that long. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly as she considered their situation. What are you suggesting? That we run? That we take the boys and disappear into the wilderness? It might be our only choice. I've gotten good at disappearing, at staying ahead of the law. We could head north, maybe into Canada, start fresh where no one knows our names. And live, how? As fugitives for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders, never able to settle anywhere for long. What kind of life is that for children? Nathan had no answer for that because he knew she was right. The past 3 years had been hell for Matthew and Daniel, constantly moving, constantly afraid, never able to make friends or feel secure. It was no way for children to grow up, and adding a pregnant woman and a newborn baby to their group would only make survival more difficult. Then what do you suggest? He asked. We go back to my homestead, we take care of the boys and my pregnancy, and we pray that Marshal Garrett doesn't have enough evidence to act on his suspicions. People get hanged in this territory every week, Nathan. One more condemned man disappearing into the wilderness might not be worth a federal investigation. And if you're wrong, Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Then we face whatever comes together. But I won't run, Nathan. That baby I'm carrying deserves to be born free in a real home, not in some cave or abandoned shack. And your boys deserve the chance to go to school, to make friends, to have a childhood. Nathan wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways her plan could go wrong, but he found himself thinking about what she was offering. A real home, stability, the chance for his sons to have something approaching a normal life. It was everything he had dreamed of during the long months of running, but it seemed too good to be true. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly. Something I haven't told you about my husband's death. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. What do you mean? Thomas didn't just fall through the ice, Nathan. He was murdered. The words hung between them in the frigid air like a death sentence. Nathan stared at her, trying to process what she had just revealed. Murdered by who? Why? We never found out for certain, but Thomas had been asking questions about some business dealings in town. There were rumors of corruption, of territorial officials taking bribes to overlook certain irregularities. Thomas was never one to let sleeping dogs lie. And you think someone killed him to keep him quiet? I think someone wanted him to stop asking questions, and when he wouldn't, they made sure he couldn't ask anymore. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Nathan could hear the pain beneath her calm exterior. So you see, Nathan, we both have reasons to be careful about who we trust in redemption. Nathan felt the weight of this new revelation settling over him like a lead blanket. Not only was he a wanted man hiding in plain sight, but he was now allied with a woman who might be a target herself. The complexity of their situation was becoming almost overwhelming. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you had enough to worry about, and because I wasn't sure I could trust you yet. But if we're going to survive what's coming, we need to be honest with each other about everything. From deeper in the cave came the sound of Daniel coughing, and both adults turned their attention back to the boys. The immediate crisis of rescuing the children was over, but Nathan could see that it was just the beginning of a much larger set of challenges. The storm's letting up, Eleanor observed, looking out at the gradually slowing snowfall. We should be able to get the boys down to the wagon in a few hours. Are you sure about this? Nathan asked one more time. Once we go back to your place together, there's no hiding what you've done. The whole town will know you're harboring me. Eleanor smiled, but there was steel in her expression. Let them talk. I've been the subject of gossip before, and I'm still here. Besides, you're not just any fugitive, Nathan. You're a doctor, and this territory needs doctors badly. There might be more people willing to protect you than you think. As they settled in to wait for dawn and better traveling conditions, Nathan found himself watching Eleanor with growing amazement. She had risked everything to save a stranger's life, had ventured into a dangerous mountain storm while 7 months pregnant, and had just revealed that she was potentially in as much danger as he was. Yet she remained calm, practical, and determined to see their situation through to whatever end awaited them. Eleanor, he said quietly, why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's just because everyone deserves a second chance. There's more to it than that. She was quiet for so long that Nathan thought she might not answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, because I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to turn. After Thomas died, I was completely alone. No family nearby, no close friends, no one who really cared whether I lived or died. I spent months wondering if I should just give up, sell the homestead, and go back east to live with relatives who barely tolerated me when I was a child. What changed your mind? Eleanor's hand moved to her belly where her unborn child grew. This baby. When I realized I was pregnant, I knew I couldn't give up. This child deserves better than a mother who surrendered to despair. So I decided to fight to make a life worth living, to build something good out of what I had left. And helping us fits into that plan, how? Because building something good sometimes means helping other people build something good too. Your boys need a mother figure, Nathan, even if it's just temporary. And I need to know that I can make a difference in someone's life besides my own. Nathan understood then. Eleanor Hayes wasn't just saving his family, she was saving herself as well. She was choosing to believe that hope was stronger than fear, that love was more powerful than despair, that redemption was possible even for people who had lost everything. As the hours passed and the storm gradually spent itself against the mountain peaks, Nathan found himself daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Maybe he could stop running and start building a life again. Maybe his sons could have the childhood they deserved. Maybe Eleanor could find the family she needed. But even as hope began to take root in his heart, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that their hardest trials still lay ahead. Marshal Garrett knew who he was, and that knowledge was a loaded gun that could go off at any moment. Someone in redemption had killed Eleanor's husband, and that murderer was still walking free. And somewhere in Kansas, Judge Maxwell Reynolds was still seeking vengeance for his son's death. The dawn came slowly, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Nathan checked on his sons one last time and found their fevers had broken completely. They were weak and tired, but alert and ready for the journey ahead. "Time to go home, boys," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, the word home didn't feel like a lie. As they made their careful way down the treacherous mountain trail, Susan carrying Daniel while Matthew walked between him and Eleanor, Nathan allowed himself to imagine what life at the homestead might be like. He pictured himself helping with the spring planting, delivering Eleanor's baby, watching his sons learn to ride horses and do farm chores. It was a simple dream, but it was more than he had dared to hope for in longer than he could remember. They were halfway to the wagon when Eleanor suddenly stopped, her hand gripping Nathan's arm. "Listen," she whispered. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of horses' hooves and men's voices. Someone was coming up the mountain trail, following their tracks in the snow. Nathan's blood turned to ice. They were trapped between the cave above and whoever was approaching from below, with 2 sick children and a pregnant woman who couldn't move quickly over rough terrain. "Who would be out here in this weather?" Eleanor whispered. Nathan's jaw tightened as he recognized one of the voices carrying on the mountain air. Marshal Garrett had decided not to wait for more evidence after all. "Someone who's been looking for us," Nathan replied grimly. "We need to hide, and we need to do it now." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, their hoofbeats echoing off the granite walls of the canyon like a death knell. Nathan's mind raced as he calculated their options, none of which offered much hope. The trail they were on provided no cover, and retracing their steps to the cave would trap them in a dead end with no escape route. "There," Eleanor whispered, pointing to a cluster of wind-carved boulders about 50 yards to their right. "We can hide behind those rocks until they pass." Nathan shifted Daniel's weight in his arms, the boy still weak from fever but alert enough to sense the danger. "Can you make it that far without falling?" "I can make it," Eleanor replied with grim determination, though Nathan could see the strain of their mountain ordeal etched in the lines around her eyes. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible across the treacherous terrain, Matthew staying close to his father, while Eleanor picked her way carefully over the snow-covered rocks. Every step seemed to echo in the thin mountain air, every breath visible in ghostly puffs that might betray their position. They reached the shelter of the boulders just as the first rider came into view around a bend in the trail below. Nathan pressed himself against the cold granite Daniel clutched tight in his arms and peered through a gap in the rocks. Marshal Garrett rode at the head of a group of 4 men, his weathered face set in lines of determination. Behind him came Sheriff Brady, looking distinctly uncomfortable on horseback in the bitter cold, followed by 2 men Nathan didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested they were either bounty hunters or federal deputies. "Tracks are clear as day," one of the strangers was saying, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. 3 people, maybe 4, heading up toward the old mining claims. "Could be anyone," Sheriff Brady protested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "Plenty of folks use these trails." Marshal Garrett reined in his horse directly below their hiding spot, so close that Nathan could see the frost forming on the lawman's mustache. "Not in weather like this, Sheriff, and not with a pregnant woman in the group. Mrs. Hayes's wagon tracks are all over this trail and they're fresh." Nathan felt Eleanor stiffen beside him. The marshal had been watching her place, had seen them leave together. Their careful plans were unraveling before they'd even had a chance to implement them. "What I don't understand," Garrett continued, studying the tracks in the snow, "is why a respectable widow would risk her life and her unborn child to help a convicted thief. Unless, of course, she knows something about Jackson Blackwood that the rest of us don't." "Maybe she's just got a soft heart," Brady suggested weakly. "Or maybe," Garrett said, his voice carrying an ominous certainty, "Jackson Blackwood isn't who he claims to be." The words hit Nathan like a physical blow. Garrett knew. Perhaps he'd always known, had been waiting for the right moment to spring his trap, and now Eleanor was caught in it too, her life and her child's future hanging in the balance because she'd chosen to show mercy to a stranger. "We should keep moving," one of the bounty hunters said impatiently. "If they're up there, they're not going anywhere fast. That woman's too far along to be running through these mountains." "Patience Morrison," Garrett replied calmly. "Good hunting requires patience. They'll have to come down eventually, and when they do, we'll be waiting." Nathan closed his eyes, trying to think. Garrett was right. They couldn't stay in the mountains indefinitely, especially not with Eleanor's pregnancy and the boy's recent illness. But going back down the trail meant walking directly into the marshal's hands. The sound of horses moving away gradually faded as Garrett's party continued up the trail toward the cave. Nathan waited several long minutes before daring to move, making sure the riders were truly gone before emerging from their hiding place. "How much does he know?" Eleanor whispered, her face pale with more than just cold. "Enough to be dangerous," Nathan replied grimly. "Garrett's been tracking me for 3 years. He's patient, methodical, and he doesn't give up. If he's here, it means he's finally gathered enough evidence to make his move." "What kind of evidence?" Nathan thought about the question, trying to see their situation through the marshal's eyes. "Probably witness statements, maybe a photograph if he's lucky. The problem is, I never tried very hard to change my appearance, just my name and my profession. Someone who knew Dr. Nathan Blackwood would recognize him in Jackson Blackwood easily enough." Matthew tugged at his father's coat. "Pa, are we in trouble again?" Nathan knelt down to his son's eye level, seeing his own fears reflected in the boy's too serious face. "We might be, son. But Mrs. Hayes and I are going to figure out a way to keep everyone safe." "Are we going to have to run again?" The question cut straight to Nathan's heart. Matthew had asked it so many times over the past 3 years, always with the same mixture of resignation and desperate hope. The boy was 8 years old, but he'd never known a stable home, never had the chance to make lasting friendships, never experienced the simple security of knowing he'd sleep in the same bed tomorrow night. I don't know yet, Nathan answered honestly. But I promise you this, whatever happens, we're going to face it together. All of us. Eleanor moved closer, her hand resting gently on Matthew's shoulder. Your father's right. We're a family now, and families stick together no matter what. The word family hung in the cold air between them, heavy with possibility and fraught with danger. Nathan found himself looking at Eleanor with new eyes, seeing not just the woman who had saved his life, but someone who had chosen to bind her fate to theirs, despite knowing the risks. We need to get off this mountain, Eleanor said practically, but we can't go back the way we came, not with Garrett's men blocking the trail. Nathan studied the terrain around them, his mind automatically cataloging possible routes. There's an old mining road about 2 miles north of here. It's rough, probably impassable for a wagon, but we might be able to get the horses through. It connects to the main road about 5 miles east of town. That's a long walk in this snow, especially for the boys. It's better than a rope around my neck, Nathan replied grimly. And if Garrett's as smart as I think he is, he'll have men watching your homestead too. We need somewhere else to go, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her mind working through possibilities. There's an old line shack about 10 miles north of my place. It belongs to the Rocking M Ranch, but they only use it during summer roundup. It's isolated, defensible, and stocked with basic supplies. Whose ranch? Marcus Webb's. He's a good man, fought in the war, same as you. Lost his son at Antietam. Eleanor's voice carried a note of sadness. He might be sympathetic to a fellow veteran in trouble. Nathan considered the option. It would mean trusting another stranger with their secret, but hiding in an abandoned shack would only buy them time, not solve their fundamental problem. Eventually, they would need allies if they hoped to survive what was coming. It's risky, he said finally. Everything's risky now, Eleanor pointed out. But Marcus Webb is an honorable man. If anyone in this territory would help us, it would be him. They made their way carefully across the mountainside, avoiding the main trail and keeping to the cover of the pine forest wherever possible. The going was treacherous, with hidden rocks and sudden drop-offs concealed beneath the snow, but they pressed on with grim determination. Daniel had recovered enough strength to walk short distances, though Nathan still carried him over the worst terrain. Matthew stayed close to Eleanor, ready to help her if she stumbled, his young face set with determination that broke Nathan's heart. No 8-year-old should have to worry about protecting the adults in his life. But Matthew had learned that lesson early and hard. The old mining road, when they finally reached it, proved to be little more than a deer path carved into the mountainside. But it was passable, and more importantly, it was hidden from anyone watching the main trail. How far to the ranch? Nathan asked as they began their descent. About 3 hours on foot, maybe 4 in this snow. Eleanor replied, though Nathan could see she was struggling with the physical demands of their escape. Her pregnancy made every step more difficult, and the stress of their situation couldn't be good for either her or the baby. Are you all right? He asked quietly, falling into step beside her. I'm fine, she said automatically, but Nathan's medical training told him otherwise. She was pale, her breathing was shallow, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting pain. Eleanor, if you need to rest. I said I'm fine, she interrupted, but her tone was more exhausted than angry. We can't afford to stop, not with Garrett's men out there looking for us. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds their labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Nathan found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, watching for signs of pursuit or potential ambush sites. 3 years of running had taught him to think like prey, to always be aware of escape routes and hiding places. As they descended toward the valley floor, the landscape gradually changed from the harsh granite and pine of the high country to rolling hills covered with snow-bent grass and scattered groves of cottonwood. In the distance, Nathan could see the buildings of the Rocking M Ranch, a substantial spread with a large house, several barns, and extensive corrals. There, Eleanor said, pointing to a small structure about a mile away from the main ranch buildings. That's the line shack. The building was little more than a glorified cabin, but it looked solid and well-maintained. Smoke rose from its chimney, which gave Nathan pause. Someone's there? He observed. Eleanor squinted through the blowing snow. That's strange. The ranch hands don't usually use that shack until spring. Nathan felt the familiar tension of a situation spinning out of control. They were exhausted, exposed, and running out of options. If the line shack was occupied, they would have to find somewhere else to shelter, but his sons were approaching the limits of their endurance. "We need to know who's in there before we get any closer," Nathan said. "I'll go," Eleanor offered, but Nathan shook his head. "You're too recognizable and you can't move quickly if there's trouble. I'll scout ahead." "Pa, don't leave us," Daniel said, anxiously tugging at Nathan's coat. Nathan knelt down and pulled both boys close. "I'm just going to take a look, sons. I'll be back in a few minutes, I promise. Stay with Mrs. Hayes and keep her safe for me." The boys nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the responsibility he was placing on their young shoulders. Nathan kissed their foreheads and set off across the snow-covered field toward the line shack. As he approached the building, Nathan could hear voices inside, 2 men, maybe 3, talking in low tones. He crept closer, using the surrounding trees for cover, until he could peer through one of the small windows. What he saw made his blood run cold. Marshal Garrett sat at a rough wooden table inside the shack, along with Sheriff Brady and one of the bounty hunters from their earlier group. They had a map spread out before them, marking locations with small stones. "She'll head for her homestead first," Garrett was saying, jabbing his finger at a point on the map. "It's human nature to go to ground in familiar territory." "What if she doesn't?" Brady asked. "What if they keep running? Then we'll track them down wherever they go," Garrett replied with cold certainty. "But I don't think it will come to that. Mrs. Hayes is 7 months pregnant. She can't keep moving indefinitely. And our boy Nathan has 2 sick children to worry about. They'll need shelter, medical attention, supplies. Sooner or later, they'll have to trust someone." Nathan backed away from the window, his mind racing. Garrett had anticipated their every move, had positioned his men to cut off their escape routes. The marshal wasn't just hunting them. He was herding them, driving them toward a trap of his own design. He made his way back to where Eleanor and the boys waited, his expression grim. "Garrett's there," he reported quietly. "He's set up some kind of command post. They're tracking our movements, trying to predict where we'll go next." Eleanor's face went pale. "They know about the line shack. They know about everything, I think. Garrett's been planning this for a long time." Matthew looked up at his father with frightened eyes. "What do we do now, Pa?" Nathan looked around at the 3 people depending on him for answers, his 2 young sons and a pregnant woman who had risked everything to help them. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but it also clarified his thinking in a way that years of running and hiding had not. "We stop running," he said quietly. Eleanor stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Garrett's right about one thing: we can't keep this up indefinitely. You need medical care, the boys need stability, and I'm tired of living like a hunted animal. It's time to make a stand." "Nathan, if you surrender..." "I'm not talking about surrendering. I'm talking about fighting back. Garrett thinks he knows everything about Nathan Blackwood, but there are things even he doesn't know, things that might change the equation." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Nathan grabbed Daniel and motioned for Eleanor and Matthew to follow him into a nearby grove of cottonwoods. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the snowy field. Nathan recognized one of them immediately, Marcus Webb, the owner of the Rockingham Ranch. The other 2 were ranch hands, and they looked angry. Webb reined in his horse near the line shack and dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors, but his bearing suggested military training and hard-won authority. "Garrett," Webb shouted, "get out here!" The marshal emerged from the line shack, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Mr. Webb, what brings you out on such a fine winter day?" "Don't play games with me, Marshal. I want to know what you're doing on my property without permission." "Federal business, Mr. Webb. I'm tracking a dangerous fugitive, and I have reason to believe he might seek shelter on your land." Webb's eyes narrowed. "What kind of fugitive?" "A man named Nathan Blackwood. He's wanted for murder in Kansas, and he's traveling with a pregnant woman and 2 children. They're armed and extremely dangerous." Nathan felt his heart sink. Garrett was spinning the story to make him sound like a monster, someone who would use a pregnant woman and children as human shields. It was a clever tactic. What rancher would risk harboring someone who might harm innocent people? But Marcus Webb surprised everyone with his response. "Nathan Blackwood," Webb repeated, his voice carrying a note of recognition that made Nathan's blood freeze. "Tall man, dark hair, green eyes, about 34 years old." Garrett leaned forward, sensing important information. "You know him?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape as if he could see through trees and snow to find the man they were discussing. I might. But if it's the Nathan Blackwood I'm thinking of, then you've got your facts wrong about him being dangerous. What do you mean? The Nathan Blackwood I knew was a Union Army surgeon during the war, saved my life at Shiloh when a Confederate cannonball took off half my leg. If it hadn't been for his skill and determination, I would have bled to death in a field hospital in Tennessee. Nathan felt his world tilt on its axis. Marcus Webb remembered him. After more than a decade, through all the changes that war and hardship had wrought in his appearance, Webb had recognized his name and connected it to their shared past. Garrett's expression grew more predatory. Then you can help us bring him in peacefully. A man who saved your life surely deserves better than dying in a shootout. Maybe, Webb said carefully. But I'd want to hear his side of the story first. Nathan Blackwood was a good man and a fine doctor. If he's running from the law, I'd bet my ranch there's more to the story than what's in your warrant. From their hiding place in the cottonwoods, Nathan made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out from behind the trees, his hands raised but not in surrender and greeting. "Hello, Marcus," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered field. "It's been a long time." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Garrett's hand went to his gun. Sheriff Brady scrambled for cover behind the horses, and the bounty hunter emerged from the line shack with his rifle already aimed, but Marcus Webb held up his hand, stopping the violence before it could begin. "Easy, boys," Webb said calmly, though his eyes never left Nathan's face. "Let's all keep our heads and see what the man has to say." Nathan walked slowly across the field, very aware that multiple guns were trained on him, but trusting in Webb's authority to keep his men from shooting. Behind him, still hidden in the trees, Eleanor and the boys waited to see if his gamble would pay off. "Nathan Blackwood," Webb said when Nathan was close enough for conversation, "you look like hell." "Feel like it too," Nathan replied with a weak smile. "Thanks for stopping them from shooting me." "Don't thank me yet," Webb warned. "Marshal Garrett here says you're a wanted murderer, says you killed a man in Kansas and ran off with 2 children. That doesn't sound like the man who saved my life at Shiloh." Nathan took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of everyone he cared about. It was time to stop running from the truth and start fighting with it. "The man I killed was James Reynolds," Nathan said, clearly his voice carrying to everyone present. "He drew on me first in my own office after threatening my family. I shot him in self-defense, but his father is Judge Maxwell Reynolds, and he owns half of Kansas. I knew I'd never get a fair trial." Garrett stepped forward, his gun now drawn but pointed at the ground. "That's for a court to decide, Blackwood. You're under arrest for the murder of James Reynolds." "Wait," Webb said, holding up his hand again. "There's something you all need to know before this goes any further." The marshal paused, clearly frustrated by the interruption but unwilling to challenge Webb on his own property. "Judge Maxwell Reynolds," Webb continued, his voice taking on a hard edge, "is a war criminal. He was a Union colonel during the war, but he was cashiered for ordering the execution of Confederate prisoners at Milliken's Bend. The Army covered it up to avoid a scandal, but those of us who were there remember." Nathan stared at Webb in amazement. He had known that Judge Reynolds was corrupt and vindictive, but he had never suspected the man's military record included war crimes. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb," Garrett said carefully. "It's the truth and I can prove it. I still have friends in Washington who remember the Reynolds case. If Nathan here killed that bastard's son, then he probably did the world a favor." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Eleanor emerged from the trees, leading both boys by the hand, her decision made for reasons Nathan couldn't fathom. "That's enough," she called out, her voice ringing with authority despite her exhaustion. "I won't have guns drawn around children." All eyes turned to her as she approached the group, her pregnancy obvious even beneath her heavy coat. Daniel and Matthew stayed close to her sides, their young faces serious but unafraid. "Mrs. Hayes," Sheriff Brady said weakly, "you shouldn't be here." "I'm exactly where I need to be, Sheriff," Eleanor replied firmly, "and I have something to say about this situation." She moved to stand beside Nathan, her presence transforming him from an isolated fugitive into part of a family unit. "Nathan Blackwood is under my protection according to territorial law. He's committed no crimes in Montana, and he's been nothing but honorable in his dealings with me and my family." "Your family?" Garrett asked suspiciously. Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "My family. Nathan is the father of my unborn child." The lie hit the group like a thunderclap. Nathan stared at Eleanor in shock, understanding immediately what she was doing, but amazed by the boldness of it. By claiming him as the father of her child, she was making their relationship legitimate in the eyes of the law and society, giving him legal protections he wouldn't have as a mere hired hand. "That's impossible," Brady protested. "Thomas Hayes only died 6 months ago." "Thomas Hayes was not the father of this child," Eleanor said calmly, her hand resting on her belly. "Nathan and I have been acquainted for longer than anyone in town realized." It was a masterful deception, one that recast their entire relationship in terms that frontier society could understand and accept. A widow taking up with a man who could provide for her and her child was not only acceptable, but practical. It gave Eleanor a reason to help Nathan that had nothing to do with the law of claim or misguided charity. Marcus Webb looked from Nathan to Eleanor and back again, his weathered face thoughtful. "Well, that puts a different complexion on things, doesn't it?" Marshal Garrett's face was red with frustration. It doesn't matter what their relationship is. Nathan Blackwood is still wanted for murder in Kansas. "Maybe," Webb said slowly, "but that's Kansas law, not Montana law, and it seems to me that a man has a right to protect his family regardless of what state he's in." The standoff continued for several long minutes, with Garrett clearly wanting to make his arrest but unwilling to start a gunfight on Webb's property. Finally, the marshal holstered his weapon, though his expression remained dangerous. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he warned. "I'll be watching you, and if you step 1 foot out of line, I'll drag you back to Kansas in chains." "I understand," Nathan replied evenly, "but I'm not running anymore, Marshal. If Judge Reynolds wants justice for his son's death, he can come to Montana and face me like a man." Garrett's eyes glittered with something like anticipation. "Careful what you wish for, Doctor. The judge has a long reach, and he doesn't forget." As the federal lawmen mounted their horses and rode away, Nathan felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate crisis had passed, but Eleanor's desperate lie had created new complications that would be difficult to maintain. How long could they pretend to be a couple? What would happen when her real child was born and clearly wasn't his? "Well," Marcus Webb said, breaking the tense silence, "I think we all need to get out of this cold and have a proper conversation. Mrs. Hayes, you look like you could use some medical attention, and those boys need a hot meal. My house is just over that ridge." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Webb." "It's the least I can do for the man who saved my life," Webb replied, then turned to Nathan with a serious expression. "Though I think we need to talk about what comes next. Garrett may have backed down for now, but he's not the type to give up easily." As they walked toward the ranch house, Nathan found himself walking beside Eleanor, the boys running ahead through the snow. The crisis had brought them closer together, but it had also complicated their relationship in ways he was still trying to understand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "What you did back there, claiming me as the father, that was quick thinking." Eleanor glanced at him sideways. "It wasn't entirely altruistic, Nathan. I need a father for this child, and you need legitimacy in this community. It seemed like a practical arrangement." "Is that all it is? Practical?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. "I don't know yet, but I think we're about to find out." The warmth of Marcus Webb's ranch house enveloped them like a protective embrace, the crackling fire in the massive stone hearth driving away the mountain cold that had seeped into their bones during the harrowing escape. Nathan found himself standing in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of the scene. Comfortable furniture, family photographs on the mantelpiece, the lingering aroma of coffee and bacon from the morning meal. It had been so long since he'd been inside a real home that he'd almost forgotten what sanctuary felt like. "Martha," Webb called out to his wife, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "We have guests who need tending to." Martha Webb took one look at Eleanor's pale, exhausted face and immediately took charge with the efficiency of someone accustomed to frontier emergencies. "That woman needs to be off her feet immediately," she declared, bustling forward to support Eleanor's elbow. "And those boys look half frozen. Come along, all of you, and let's get you properly warmed up." Daniel and Matthew hung back shyly, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from danger to domesticity. Nathan knelt down to their level, placing a reassuring hand on each small shoulder. "It's all right, boys," he said gently. "Mr. and Mrs. Webb are friends. They're going to help us." "Are we safe now, Pa?" Matthew asked, his 8-year-old eyes holding too much wisdom about the precarious nature of safety. Nathan exchanged a meaningful glance with Webb before answering. "Safer than we've been in a long time, son, but we still need to be careful." Martha Webb had already taken Eleanor under her wing, settling her in the most comfortable chair near the fire and covering her with a warm quilt. "When's this baby due, dear?" she asked with the practiced eye of a woman who had birthed and raised 4 children of her own. 2 months, maybe a bit less," Eleanor replied, unconsciously cradling her belly. The stress of their ordeal was beginning to show. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and Nathan's medical training told him she was exhibiting early signs of premature labor stress. "Marcus," Nathan said quietly, drawing his host aside, "I need to examine Mrs. Hayes. The journey and the excitement may have affected her condition." Webb nodded, understanding. "Use our bedroom. Martha will help with whatever you need." As Nathan helped Eleanor to the privacy of the bedroom, he became acutely aware of the strange intimacy their deception had created. For the past few hours, they had been playing the roles of expectant parents, and the fiction was beginning to feel disturbingly real. "You didn't have to claim me as the father," Nathan said quietly as he checked Eleanor's pulse, noting its rapid, irregular rhythm. "That was a dangerous lie to tell." "Was it a lie?" Eleanor asked, her brown eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause in his examination. "Eleanor, you know it was. Your husband, Thomas, wasn't the father of this child." She interrupted, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after his funeral. The timing was impossible." Nathan stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed suddenly clicking into place. "Then, who—" "A traveling merchant who came through in the fall," Eleanor said matter-of-factly, though Nathan could see the shame and pain behind her calm exterior. "Thomas had been drinking heavily, gambling away our savings. I was lonely, hurt, and I made a foolish mistake. When I realized what had happened, the man was long gone." The revelation hit Nathan like a physical blow. Eleanor's desperate act at the gallows hadn't been entirely altruistic. She had been protecting herself as much as him. An unmarried pregnant woman in frontier territory faced ostracism, poverty, and worse. By claiming Nathan as the father, she was legitimizing her situation and providing her child with a future. "So when you stepped forward at the execution," Nathan said slowly, understanding dawning, "you weren't just saving a stranger's life." "I was saving my own," Eleanor admitted. "And my child's. A widow with a bastard baby has few options, Nathan, but a widow who remarries and bears her new husband's child, that's respectable. That's survivable." Nathan resumed his examination, his mind reeling from this new information. Eleanor's breathing was shallow, her abdomen tense in a way that concerned him. "You're showing signs of premature labor stress," he said, shifting into his professional demeanor. "Nothing immediate, but we need to be very careful over the next few days. Will the baby be all right? If we can keep you calm and rested, quizás. But no more mountain rescues or dramatic confrontations with federal marshals." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "I'll try to keep the excitement to a minimum." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Dr. Blackwood?" Martha Webb's voice carried through the wood. "I've got some willow bark tea steeping, and the boys are asking for their father." Nathan helped Eleanor back to the main room, where he found Matthew and Daniel sitting at Webb's kitchen table attacking bowls of beef stew with the focused intensity of children who had been too hungry for too long. The sight of his sons eating a proper meal in a warm, safe house made his chest tight with emotion. "Feeling better?" Webb asked as Eleanor settled back into her chair by the fire. "Much, thank you," Eleanor replied, accepting a cup of Martha's medicinal tea. "Your hospitality is more than we could have hoped for." Webb pulled up a chair facing them, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what happens next. Garrett may have backed down today, but he's not going to give up. He'll be watching, waiting for any excuse to move against you." "I know," Nathan said, pulling Daniel onto his lap while Matthew leaned against his shoulder. "The question is whether we try to disappear again or make a stand here." "Running's no good," Webb said firmly. Garrett's too persistent, and you've got too many people depending on you now. Besides, this territory needs doctors. Good ones are scarce as hen's teeth out here. Nathan felt a familiar stirring of purpose at the mention of his abandoned profession. I haven't practiced medicine in over 2 years, Marcus. I'm not sure I remember how. Like riding a horse? Martha Webb interjected from the kitchen. Some things you never really forget, and there's plenty of folks around here who could use a doctor's care. The problem is my legal status, Nathan pointed out. Even if the local community would accept me, Garrett's watching every move I make. The moment I start practicing medicine openly, he'll use it as evidence that I'm not just a drifter named Jackson Blackwood. Webb was quiet for a moment, clearly working through the implications. What if you weren't Nathan Blackwood anymore? What if you were someone else entirely? Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? I mean new identity papers, a fresh start legally speaking. I've got friends in the territorial government, people who owe me favors. It wouldn't be the first time someone in this territory got a second chance with a clean slate. Nathan stared at him. That's a serious risk for you to take, Marcus. If anyone found out you helped falsify government documents. Let me worry about that, Webb interrupted. You saved my life once, Nathan. I figure that gives me the right to try saving yours. Before Nathan could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Webb immediately moved to the window, his hand instinctively going to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Shit, he muttered, then glanced apologetically at Martha. Sorry, dear, it's Garrett again, and he's got more men with him this time. Nathan's blood turned to ice. How many? 6, maybe 7, and they're armed for business. Eleanor struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her back. They can't arrest him on your property without a warrant, can they? Depends on how badly they want him, Webb replied grimly. Federal marshals have a lot of latitude when they're chasing fugitives. Nathan stood up gently, moving his sons away from him. I won't let this turn into a gunfight with children present. And I won't let them take you without a fight, Webb declared, checking his rifle. Marcus, no, you've already risked enough. This is my property, my decision, Webb cut him off. And I've got legal rights here that even federal marshals have to respect. The horses stopped outside, and Nathan could hear Garrett's voice issuing orders to his men. Through the window, he could see the marshal positioning his deputies around the house, cutting off potential escape routes. Dr. Blackwood, Garrett called out, his voice carrying easily through the crisp mountain air. I know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible, and nobody needs to get hurt. Webb moved to the door, but didn't open it. This is private property, Marshal. You got business here, you better have a warrant. I don't need a warrant to pursue a fugitive, Webb, and I've got witnesses who saw Blackwood on your land. Then you also got witnesses who saw me offer him hospitality. Nothing illegal about that. Nathan could hear the tension in the marshal's voice when he replied. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The man's wanted for murder. You harboring him makes you an accessory. The man's under the protection of territorial law, Webb shot back. And he's committed no crimes in Montana. You want him, you better have more than Kansas paper and federal bluster. Nathan moved to Eleanor's side, taking her hand in his. If this goes bad, he said quietly, take the boys and get to the root cellar. There's probably a way out through there. I'm not leaving you, Eleanor said firmly. You have to think of the baby. I am thinking of the baby. And the baby needs a father. The simple declaration hit Nathan harder than any of Garrett's threats. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to be a real father to Eleanor's child, to have a legitimate family again, to practice medicine in a community that needed him. Outside, Garrett was growing impatient. I'm giving you 5 minutes, Webb, then we're coming in. Webb turned to Nathan, his weathered face set with determination. There's something I haven't told you about Judge Reynolds and his war record, something that might change everything. What do you mean? I mean, I've got documentation of his war crimes, official reports, witness statements, photographs, everything the Army buried to avoid scandal. Nathan stared at him in amazement. Why didn't you mention this before? Because using it would mean admitting I've been sitting on evidence of war crimes for over a decade. But if it means stopping that bastard from destroying your family? Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with sudden hope. If you could prove Reynolds is a war criminal, wouldn't that discredit any legal action he's taking against Nathan? More than that, Webb said grimly. It would probably land him in federal prison. A man like that has made a lot of enemies over the years. They've just been waiting for someone brave enough to come forward. Nathan felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, not just hope, but the possibility of genuine justice. What would you need from me? Your testimony about what really happened when you killed James Reynolds, a sworn statement that you were acting in self-defense against a man who was threatening your family. And in return, I make sure Judge Reynolds never threatens you or anyone else again. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Garrett had apparently decided not to wait for his 5-minute deadline. "Time's up, Webb," the marshal called out. "I'm coming in." Webb moved to the door, his rifle ready, but pointed at the floor. "You come through that door without a warrant, Marshal, and you'll be trespassing. I've got rights and I know how to defend them." "This is federal business." "This is Montana territory," Webb interrupted, "and you're on my land threatening my guests. That makes it my business." Nathan could hear the uncertainty in Garrett's voice when he replied. The marshal was clearly outside his comfort zone, dealing with a man who knew the law and wasn't intimidated by federal authority. "I can get a warrant," Garrett said finally. "Then get one." Webb shot back. "But until you do, Dr. Blackwood is under my protection as a guest in my home." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Nathan heard Garrett giving orders to his men to fall back. Apparently, the marshal had decided that a direct confrontation wasn't worth the legal complications it would create. "This isn't over, Blackwood," Garrett called out as the sound of horses indicated his party was withdrawing. "I'll be back with proper papers." Webb waited until the sounds of the departing horses had faded completely before setting down his rifle. "That buys us some time, but not much. Garrett's got connections. He'll have his warrant within a day or two." "Then we need to move fast," Nathan said. "If you're serious about exposing Reynolds, we need to do it before Garrett comes back." "I'm serious," Webb confirmed, "but it means sending a telegram to some very powerful people in Washington. Once I do that, there's no going back. They'll want a full investigation testimony evidence. It'll be a scandal that reaches all the way to the War Department." Eleanor had been listening to their conversation with growing excitement. But it would clear Nathan's name, wouldn't it? "If you can prove that Judge Reynolds is corrupt, that he's been using his position to pursue personal vendettas." "More than clear it," Webb said. "It would make Nathan a hero for standing up to a war criminal. Public opinion would shift completely." Nathan looked around the room at the people who had become his unlikely family, Eleanor with her unborn child, his 2 sons who desperately needed stability, Marcus and Martha Webb who were risking everything to help strangers. The weight of their faith in him was both terrifying and inspiring. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Webb smiled, the first genuinely hopeful expression Nathan had seen from him. "Help me write a telegram that's going to change everything." As they worked together to compose their message to Webb's contacts in Washington, Nathan found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. Less than a week ago, he had been a nameless drifter facing execution for theft. Now, he was about to become the key witness in a case that could bring down one of the most powerful men in Kansas. "There's something else," Webb said as they finished their draft. "About the new identity papers I mentioned, I wasn't just talking about forged documents." "What do you mean?" "I mean a legitimate appointment as territorial physician for this district. It's a real position, comes with official papers, legal status, the works. The current holder is retiring and the job is mine to fill." Nathan stared at him. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a life," Webb corrected. "A chance to be Dr. Nathan Blackwood again, legally and openly. To practice medicine, raise your family, be part of a community." Eleanor reached over and took Nathan's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We could have a real home," she said quietly. "The children could go to school, have friends. The baby could grow up safe." Nathan looked at his sons who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus of children whose lives had been shaped by adult decisions. "What do you boys think? Would you like to stay here, go to school, maybe learn to ride horses?" Matthew's face lit up with an expression Nathan hadn't seen in years, pure, uncomplicated joy. "Really, Pa, we wouldn't have to run anymore. Not if everything works out the way Mr. Webb thinks it will." Daniel bounced on his toes with excitement. "Can we have a dog? And can I help take care of the baby?" Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and hopeful in the warm room. "I think we can arrange both of those things." As the evening wore on and plans began to take shape, Nathan found himself experiencing something he had almost forgotten: the ability to think about the future with hope instead of fear. Webb's telegram would go out in the morning, setting in motion a chain of events that would either free them completely or destroy them all. But for tonight, they were safe, warm, and together. For tonight, they could imagine what it would be like to be a real family, to have a place where they belonged, to sleep without fear of what tomorrow might bring. "Nathan," Eleanor said quietly as they prepared makeshift sleeping arrangements in Webb's parlor, "when this is all over, when we're free to make our own choices, what happens to us?" Nathan looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had saved his life, but the woman who had chosen to bind her fate to his despite knowing the risks. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out." Eleanor smiled, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly, where their fictional child grew, the child that had already made them a family in the eyes of the law, if not yet in their hearts. "So would I," she said. Outside, the Montana winter continued its relentless assault on the landscape, but inside Marcus Webb's ranch house, 5 people who had been strangers just days before began to forge the bonds that would either save them all or bind them together in destruction. As Nathan settled down to sleep on the floor near his sons, he found himself thinking about the telegram they would send in the morning. Somewhere in Kansas, Judge Maxwell Reynolds was probably sleeping peacefully in his mansion, secure in his power, and confident that his son's killer would soon face justice. Reynolds had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him, that the war crimes he thought buried forever were about to be dragged into the light. Nathan allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction at the thought of the judge's reaction when federal investigators came knocking on his door. But satisfaction was tempered by realism. Powerful men like Reynolds didn't go down without a fight, and they had resources Nathan could barely imagine. The battle ahead would be dangerous, with no guarantee of victory. As he drifted off to sleep, Nathan's last conscious thought was of Eleanor's question: what happens to us when this is all over? The answer, he realized, would depend not just on their courage and determination, but on whether love could grow from the seeds of desperation and mutual need. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Nathan Blackwood was sleeping in a house that felt like home, surrounded by people who felt like family. It was enough. For now, it was enough. In the morning, everything would change. But change, Nathan was beginning to understand, wasn't always something to fear. Sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, change could be the key to redemption. The wind outside howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the promise of storm and the whisper of hope. Inside the ranch house, 5 souls who had found each other in the darkness slept peacefully, dreaming of a future where the past could finally be forgiven and family could be chosen rather than simply endured. Dawn came with deceptive gentleness, painting the snow-covered Montana landscape in shades of rose and gold that belied the storm of controversy about to be unleashed across 2 territories. Nathan woke to the sound of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling, the domestic sounds so normal and peaceful that for a moment he forgot the precarious nature of their situation. Then he saw Eleanor stirring in the chair where she had spent the night, one hand unconsciously protecting her belly, and reality came flooding back. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, moving to check on her before the household fully awakened. "Better," she said, though Nathan's trained eye could see the lingering exhaustion in her face. "The baby's been restless all night, but I think the worst has passed." Nathan knelt beside her chair, placing his hand gently on her abdomen. Through the fabric of her dress, he could feel the subtle movements of the child within the child that the world now believed was his. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, and Nathan conducted a brief examination, his medical instincts taking over. The tension in her abdomen had decreased significantly, and her pulse was stronger and more regular than it had been the previous evening. "Everything seems normal," he assured her. "But you need real rest, not sleeping upright in a chair." "There wasn't exactly a choice," Eleanor pointed out with a tired smile. "Though I have to admit, it's been a long time since I felt this safe." Before Nathan could respond, the sound of small feet on wooden floors announced the arrival of his sons. Matthew and Daniel appeared in the doorway, their faces bright with the kind of curiosity that came from sleeping in a warm, secure place after months of uncertainty. "Pa," Daniel said, climbing onto Nathan's lap with the casual affection of a child who finally felt safe enough to be vulnerable. Mr. Webb says he's going to teach us to ride horses today. After we send the telegram, Matthew added with the solemn precision of an 8-year-old who understood that adult business took precedence over fun. He says it's very important. Nathan exchanged glances with Eleanor, the telegram that could either free them or destroy them completely. Marcus Webb emerged from the kitchen already dressed for the day's work, his weathered face set with determination. "Ready to change the world?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he understood the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this," Nathan replied, settling Daniel more comfortably on his lap. "You're sure about your contacts in Washington?" "Sure as I can be about anything in politics," Webb said. "Senator Morrison owes me more favors than he can count, and he's been looking for an excuse to go after the corruption in the territorial courts. Your testimony about Reynolds could be exactly what he needs." Martha Webb appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray laden with coffee, eggs, and fresh biscuits. "You'll all need a proper breakfast before you start changing the government," she declared with the practical wisdom of a frontier wife. "Can't fight corruption on an empty stomach." As they ate, Webb outlined his plan in more detail. The telegram would go to Senator Morrison in Washington, providing an overview of the situation and requesting an immediate investigation into Judge Reynolds' war record and current judicial conduct. Simultaneously, Webb would send messages to territorial authorities, formally requesting Nathan's appointment as district physician and providing documentation of his medical credentials. "The timing is crucial," Webb explained. "We need to move faster than Garrett can get his warrant. Once the federal investigation starts, it'll be much harder for Reynolds to use his influence to have you arrested." "What if Morrison doesn't respond?" Eleanor asked, practical as always. "What if he decides it's too risky to challenge a sitting judge?" Webb's expression darkened. "Then we'll have stirred up a hornet's nest for nothing, and we'll all be in more danger than before." "But I don't think it'll come to that. Morrison's been waiting for an opportunity like this for years." Nathan found himself studying the faces around the breakfast table, his sons who were finally relaxed enough to act like normal children, Eleanor whose courage continued to amaze him, the Webbs who were risking everything to help virtual strangers. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but it was also clarifying. These people had given him something worth fighting for. "Let's do it," he said simply. The ride into redemption took on the quality of a final gamble with everything they had worked for hanging in the balance. Webb had insisted on accompanying them personally, leaving his ranch in the care of his foreman while he dealt with what he called the most important business of my life. Eleanor rode beside Nathan in Webb's wagon, the boys tucked safely between them, while Webb himself rode alongside on horseback. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, as if the very act of deciding to fight back had changed their perspective on everything around them. "Nervous?" Eleanor asked quietly as they approached the outskirts of town. "Terrified," Nathan admitted, "but also hopeful, I think. For the first time in years, we're not just running away from something. We're moving towards something better. Even if it doesn't work. Even if Reynolds proves too powerful to bring down." Nathan considered the question seriously. "Even then, because at least we'll have tried. At least my sons will know their father didn't spend his whole life running from fights." The telegraph office sat on Main Street, a small building that served as Redemption's primary connection to the outside world. As they approached, Nathan could see people on the street stopping to stare, their conversations dying as they recognized the group. Word of yesterday's confrontation had clearly spread throughout the small community. "Let them look," Webb said firmly as he dismounted. "By tonight, they'll either be calling you a hero or attending your funeral. Either way, you'll be famous." The telegraph operator, a thin man named Peterson, who had been sending messages across the territory for 15 years, looked up nervously as they entered his office. "Morning, Mr. Webb. What can I do for you folks?" "Need to send some messages, Peterson, important ones." Webb handed over the carefully composed telegrams they had prepared. "This first one goes to Senator Morrison in Washington. Priority message, spare no expense." Peterson read the first few lines and his eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Webb, are you sure about this? This is some pretty serious accusations you're making here." "Dead sure. Send it exactly as written." As Peterson began tapping out the message on his telegraph key, Nathan found himself holding his breath. Each click of the apparatus was carrying their accusations across hundreds of miles of wire, setting in motion events that could not be stopped or recalled. The second message goes to Territorial Governor Mills, Webb continued, handing over another sheet of paper, and the third to the Territorial Medical Board. Peterson's expression grew more bewildered with each message. "Mr. Webb, I don't mean to pry, but what exactly are you folks stirring up here?" "Justice," Webb replied simply, "or at least the attempt at it." While the telegrams were being sent, Nathan became aware of a commotion outside. Through the window, he could see a crowd gathering, their voices rising in animated discussion. At the center of the group stood Marshal Garrett, his face dark with fury as he argued with Sheriff Brady. "Trouble," Nathan murmured, nodding toward the window. Webb looked outside and cursed under his breath. "Peterson, how much longer on those messages?" "Almost done with the first one, sir. Give me 10 more minutes for the others." "We don't have 10 minutes, Eleanor observed quietly. "Garrett looks like he's working himself up to something." As if summoned by her words, the marshal pushed through the crowd and strode toward the telegraph office, his hand resting ominously on his gun butt. Nathan instinctively moved to shield his sons, while Webb positioned himself between the door and their small group. Garrett burst through the door without ceremony, his eyes immediately fixing on Nathan. "Dr. Nathan Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murder of James Reynolds." "On what authority?" Webb demanded, stepping forward. "You got that warrant you were talking about?" Garrett produced a folded document from his coat. "Federal warrant signed by a territorial judge. Dr. Blackwood, you'll come with me peacefully, or I'll drag you out of here in chains." Eleanor rose from her chair with deliberate dignity, one hand supporting her back as she faced the marshal. "Marshal Garrett, I'm curious about something. Which territorial judge signed that warrant?" Garrett's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Judge Morrison out of Helena." "Why, okay." Eleanor smiled an expression that held no warmth. "Because Judge Morrison is Senator Morrison's brother, and about 10 minutes ago Mr. Webb sent a telegram to the senator detailing some very interesting information about Judge Reynolds and his son's death." The color drained from Garrett's face as the implications hit him. "What kind of information?" "The kind that turns murder charges into self-defense claims," Webb said calmly. "The kind that exposes judicial corruption and federal overreach. The kind that ends careers." Nathan watched the marshal's expression change from confidence to uncertainty to something approaching panic. Garrett had clearly not expected their situation to become a matter of federal political interest. "It doesn't matter," Garrett said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "I have a valid warrant." "You have a piece of paper," Webb corrected, "but its validity depends on the honesty of the judge who signed it, and that honesty is about to be called into serious question." Peterson looked up from his telegraph key. "Mr. Webb, I've got a reply coming in from Washington. Priority message." The small office fell silent except for the rapid clicking of the telegraph apparatus. Peterson scribbled notes as the message came through, his expression growing more amazed with each word. "Well," Webb demanded when the clicking stopped. Peterson cleared his throat nervously. "Message from Senator Morrison says federal investigators are being dispatched immediately to Kansas to investigate Judge Reynolds. Says all legal proceedings involving Dr. Blackwood are to be suspended pending completion of the investigation." The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan felt Eleanor's hand slip into his, her fingers squeezing with relief and triumph. His sons looked up at him with confusion, but growing hope, sensing that something important had shifted in their favor. Garrett stared at the telegram as if it were a poisonous snake. "That's impossible. Reynolds is one of the most respected judges in Kansas." "Respected men sometimes have the darkest secrets," Webb observed. "Senator Morrison takes corruption very seriously, especially when it involves military cover-ups." Another series of clicks announced a second incoming message. Peterson's eyes widened as he transcribed it. "This one's from Governor Mills. Says Dr. Blackwood is hereby appointed as territorial physician for the Redemption District effective immediately. Says he's under territorial protection pending resolution of all legal matters." Nathan felt the world shift around him. In the span of 20 minutes, he had gone from a hunted fugitive to a territorial official with legal protection. It seemed too good to be true, too simple an ending to years of running and fear. "There's more," Peterson continued, still reading from the message. "Governor says Marshal Garrett is to cease all pursuit activities and return to federal duties immediately. Any interference with territorial jurisdiction will be considered a federal crime. Garrett's face had gone from pale to red to a dangerous shade of purple. This is political interference with a legitimate federal investigation. No, Webb said calmly. This is what happens when you try to use federal authority to pursue personal vendettas. You picked the wrong man to hunt Marshall. Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to stand beside Nathan with the dignity of a woman who had just seen her desperate gamble pay off. Marshal Garrett, I believe you have federal duties to attend to elsewhere. For a moment, Nathan thought Garrett might draw his gun anyway. Consequences be damned. The marshal's hand twitched toward his weapon, his face contorted with years of frustration and defeat. But then Sheriff Brady appeared in the doorway, flanked by several townspeople who had clearly heard about the morning's developments. Marshal, Brady said carefully, might be best if you moved along now. Folks in town are getting worked up, and I can't guarantee your safety if you try to arrest our new territorial physician. Garrett looked around the office, taking in the hostile faces, the official telegrams, the complete collapse of his careful plans. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice thick with defeated rage. Yes, Nathan said quietly, it is. After Garrett and his men had ridden out of town, the real celebration began. Word of Nathan's appointment spread through Redemption like wildfire, and before noon a steady stream of visitors was arriving at Webb's ranch to meet their new doctor and to hear the full story of the morning's events. Eleanor found herself in the unexpected position of being treated like a frontier celebrity, the brave woman who had risked everything to save an innocent man. She bore the attention with grace, though Nathan could see the exhaustion beginning to take its toll. You need rest, he told her as they finally found a moment alone on Webb's front porch, watching his sons learn to ride horses under the careful supervision of Webb's ranch hands. I need to know this is real, Eleanor replied, her hand moving to her belly where their fictional child continued to grow. I keep expecting to wake up and find ourselves back in that cave, cold and desperate and running out of options. Nathan understood the feeling. After years of expecting the worst, it was difficult to accept that things might actually work out in their favor. Webb's contacts seemed solid, and those telegrams were official. I think we're really free. Free to do what? To be what? It was the question that had been hovering between them all day. Nathan Blackwood was officially dead, his wanted posters soon to be recalled. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, territorial physician, was free to build whatever life he chose. But what did that mean for his relationship with Eleanor? What did it mean for the child she carried, who would be born into a world that believed Nathan was the father? Free to find out what comes next, Nathan said finally. Free to see if what we've built out of desperation can become something real. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching Matthew help Daniel stay balanced on a gentle mare. The baby will need a name when it's born, a real name, not just the fiction we've created. What would you like to call her? Her. Nathan smiled. Just a feeling. What would you name a daughter born out of all this chaos? Eleanor considered the question seriously. Hope, she said finally. Hope Hayes Blackwood, a name that looks toward the future instead of dwelling on the past. Hope Hayes Blackwood, Nathan repeated, testing the sound of it. I like it. It has strength. She'll need strength growing up as the daughter of a reformed fugitive and a widow with secrets. She'll have more than strength, Nathan said, moving closer to Eleanor on the porch steps. She'll have parents who chose each other, who built a family out of love instead of just accepting what fate handed them. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. Parents who chose each other? Nathan took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Eleanor Hayes, I know our relationship started as a deception, a practical arrangement born out of mutual need, but if you're willing, I'd like to see if we can make it something more, something real. Even though the child isn't yours, especially because the child isn't mine, because it means you're choosing to trust me with the most precious thing in your life, because it means we're building a family based on choice, not just biology. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though Nathan could see they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. Nathan Blackwood, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing that we stop pretending and start living. I'm proposing that we give our children, all of them, the stable, loving home they deserve. And I'm proposing that you stop being so formal about it and kiss me, Eleanor said with a laugh that sounded like music after months of fear and uncertainty, As Nathan leaned in to kiss the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one, he heard the sound of approaching horses. But this time, instead of feeling panic, he felt only mild curiosity. Marshal Garrett was gone, Judge Reynolds was about to face federal investigation, and Dr. Nathan Blackwood was officially under territorial protection. The rider who appeared around the bend in the road was Reverend Ezekiel Reed Redemption's elderly minister, his weathered face bright with excitement. "Dr. Blackwood," he called out as he dismounted, "I've come to discuss wedding arrangements. The town's buzzing with news that you and Mrs. Hayes are planning to make things official." Nathan and Eleanor exchanged amused glances. News traveled fast in small frontier communities, especially news involving romance and redemption. "We haven't exactly set a date yet, Reverend," Eleanor said diplomatically. "Well, no time like the present," Reed declared cheerfully. "Spring's coming, the weather's clearing, and the whole territory's talking about your story. Folks would love to see a proper wedding celebration." Nathan found himself looking forward to the idea of a real wedding, a public celebration of their commitment, instead of the desperate deception that had brought them together. "What do you think?" he asked Eleanor. "Ready to make an honest man of me?" "I think," Eleanor said, rising from the porch steps with Nathan's help, "that it's time to stop running from happiness and start running toward it." As winter slowly gave way to spring over the next few weeks, Nathan settled into his new role as territorial physician with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the war. His first official patient was Eleanor herself, whom he monitored carefully as her pregnancy progressed toward its conclusion. The small cabin behind the medical office that came with his territorial appointment had been transformed into a real home with Eleanor's practical touches and the boys' growing collection of schoolbooks and writing equipment. It was cramped and simple, but it was theirs in a way that nowhere had been for years. Matthew and Daniel had enrolled in Redemption's small school, where they were slowly learning to trust that they wouldn't have to leave suddenly in the middle of the night. Daniel had made friends with the minister's grandson, while Matthew had developed a serious interest in following in his father's medical footsteps. "Pa," Matthew said one evening as Nathan reviewed his medical journals by lamplight, "Mrs. Patterson says her baby's coming soon and she wants you to deliver it. She says you're the best doctor this territory's ever had." Nathan smiled at his son's proud tone. "That's very flattering, but I suspect it has more to do with being the only doctor this territory's had in 5 years. Will you teach me to be a doctor too?" The question caught Nathan off guard. For years he had avoided thinking about his son's futures, focused only on keeping them alive day by day. Now, suddenly, they had the luxury of planning ahead, of choosing paths instead of simply surviving. "If that's what you really want," Nathan said seriously, "then yes, but doctoring is hard work, Matthew. It means studying for years, learning to make life and death decisions, carrying the weight of other people's pain. Like you do," Matthew said simply. "I want to help people like you do." Before Nathan could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, one hand supporting her very pregnant belly. "Nathan, I think it's time." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical preparation and personal emotion. Nathan had delivered dozens of babies during his career, but this was different. This was his wife, for they had been married 3 weeks earlier in a ceremony that had drawn people from all over the territory, and this was the child who would complete their unconventional family. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Hope Hayes Blackwood made her entrance into the world with a lusty cry that announced her intention to be heard. She was perfect. Tiny but strong, with Eleanor's brown eyes and a cap of dark hair that reminded Nathan of his own sons when they were born. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, cradling their daughter with the exhausted joy of a woman who had successfully navigated both childbirth and the complicated process of building a family from scratch. "She's perfect," Nathan agreed, though he was looking not just at the baby but at the entire scene, Eleanor in their bed, Hope in her arms, Matthew and Daniel crowding close to get their first look at their new sister, sunlight streaming through windows of a house that was truly their home. "What do we tell her when she's old enough to ask about her real father?" Eleanor asked quietly. Nathan considered the question seriously. "We tell her the truth, that her biological father was a man who couldn't stay, but that she was born into a family that chose to love her. We tell her that sometimes the most real relationships are the ones we build by choice, not just accident. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Montana landscape in brilliant shades of gold and red, Nathan stood on the front porch of their expanded home, watching his sons play with their baby sister while Eleanor tended to her garden. A letter had arrived that morning from Washington, informing him that Judge Maxwell Reynolds had been arrested on federal charges related to his wartime conduct and judicial corruption. The investigation had uncovered decades of abuse of power, and Reynolds would likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The nightmare that had begun with James Reynolds' death in a Kansas doctor's office was finally over. Nathan Blackwood was truly free, his name cleared, his family safe, his future secure in a way he had never dared to hope. As Eleanor joined him on the porch, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, Nathan reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a desperate fugitive, facing execution for theft. Now he was a respected doctor, a husband, a father, and a valued member of a community that had embraced his family without reservation. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked, settling beside him to watch their children play in the fading light. Nathan considered the question seriously. The road to redemption had been marked by fear, desperation, and impossible choices. There had been moments when he had been certain they would all be destroyed by the forces arrayed against them. But looking at his family now safe and happy and whole, he could honestly say he regretted none of it. "Only one," he said finally. "What's that?" Nathan smiled, pulling his wife and daughter closer as their son's laughter echoed across the peaceful valley. "That it took me so long to realize that running away from trouble isn't nearly as effective as running toward something worth fighting for." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the crisp mountain air. "Well, Dr. Blackwood, I'd say we've definitely found something worth fighting for." As the sun set behind the Montana peaks, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, Nathan Blackwood held his chosen family close and allowed himself to believe finally and completely in the possibility of happily ever after. It had taken the Noose a desperate gamble and the courage of a pregnant widow to teach him that redemption was possible, even for those who had lost everything. The Montana territory stretched out before them, vast and full of possibilities, and Nathan knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as a family, as partners, as people who had learned that love was stronger than fear and that hope could triumph even in the darkest of winters.